to welcome you to the launch of the book, Social Contracts and Informal Workers in the Global South, edited by Laura Alfers, Marty Chen, and Sophie Plagerson, which includes contributions from many of my colleagues and collaborators at WeGo. This new open access book seeks to answer the question, what would a new social contract which considers widespread informal employment look like? And during today's panel, editors and contributors will discuss 4 key things: different models of social contract theory and how theory can be used to support organizing and advocacy, the critical issue of social protection coverage and how workers' organizations can catalyze change, the necessity of social contracts that transcend national structures, drawing from the lived experience of informal home workers, and 3 social contract scenarios in the COVID-19 context, including the key features of a better new social contract for informal workers. And I'm pleased to welcome Baroness Minouche Shafik, who will be acting as our moderator and discussant today. Minouche is the director of the London School of Economics and also the author of the book, What We Owe Each Other, A New Social Contract for a Better Society. This impressive book draws on a wealth of evidence-based solutions to imagine alternative social contracts that can build on the collaboration between governments, businesses, civil society, and citizens. And the book also considers new forms of informality and self-employment. So we're pleased to have Minouche's reflections and insights throughout today's discussion. So a warm welcome to you, and please take it forward, Minouche.
Thank you very much, Rachel, and it's such a pleasure to be here. This book is such a wonderful contribution to the debate at a time when the informal sector is growing everywhere, and we need to think about what that means for our social contracts around the world. And so I'm really delighted to be moderating this discussion. And we have a wonderful panel to elucidate the debate. And I'm going to introduce them one by one before they present their work. They're all contributors to the book and very much bring different perspectives to the question of the social contract in the informal sector. We're going to hear first from Sophie Plagerson, who is visiting associate professor at the Center for Social Development in Africa at the University of Johannesburg. And Sophie's work is going to be about defining how the social contract works, what is it conceptually, and how it applies in particular to informal sector workers. So let me hand it over to Sophie first.
Super, thank you so much, Minouche, and good morning and good afternoon to everyone. And so my presentation acts simply as an introduction to the other presentations that follow, and gives a theoretical reflection on the rich evidence that really is the meat of the book. So firstly, what is a social contract? So we're talking about what holds a society together, what creates the trust for people within a society to live alongside each other, with each person considered equal. Surprisingly difficult to define. A basic standard definition is, despite variations, is something like an explicit or implicit agreement between state and citizens defining rights and obligations. But straight off the outset, several limitations emerge quite quickly from even this simple definition. Firstly, that defining a social contract within the context of the national state is not sufficient. There are many global, corporate, and institutional players who have an influence on the scope of the national state. Secondly, limiting our definition to citizens is also problematic, excluding a vast swathe of people who are then left without a voice. So we can start to move towards a definition that's more nuanced, something like a web of implicit or explicit agreements at the international, national, and local levels between a governing authority, those who fall under its jurisdiction, defining rights and obligations. Part of the argument we make is that a social contract can't be defined as a normative top-down ideal vision. In order to be relevant, it needs to incorporate the realities and context in which it's located. We particularly focus on how informal workers visualize and identify what an inclusive social contract can look like, as well as how to make it happen. So why why are we talking about social contracts in relation to informal workers at all? It's a fair question. Indeed, there are several reasons why such a choice could be regarded as irrelevant or ill-advised. So social contract theory is an influential political theory in Western philosophy, but arguably far removed from the realities of the geographical context in which informal workers are predominantly located, particularly in Africa and Asia. The most common association is with the 20th century social contract in industrialized states between labor and capital, an implicit bargain between economic and social goals, growth and productivity on the one side, redistribution, social protection, labor rights on the other. What we hear repeated over and over is that this social contract is broken and that the balance and agreement has been lost. What we argue in the book is that this prototype of a social contract was actually deeply flawed anyway. Critics highlight the gendered and racialized nature of the social contract that shaped the formation of the welfare state. Beyond this, when we look at the realities which we're discussing in relation to informal workers around the world, many of the features that characterize a careful balance between capital and labor have never been in place in many countries, leaving informal workers vulnerable and at the receiving end of several imbalanced relationships. As you can see in the second figure, I hope you can see it, capital, rather than being held in tension with labor, is actually often competing with the state for influence and power, and transcends the confines of the nation state. Importantly, for informal workers, prevailing social contracts are typically those which have disregarded informal workers, which have institutionalized disadvantageous or exclusionary systems. Dominant narratives about the informal economy have justified its systematic exclusion by stigmatizing informal workers and enterprises as non-compliant, illegal, and non-productive. In the book, we are mindful of these serious limitations, and offer evidence-based descriptions of these patterns of exploitation. However, there are also reasons which support engagement with the theory of social contracts and its application to current regional and national trends in the Global South. First, the social justice core and a strong value of equal participation between each member of society, which is part of some social contract theories, resonates with our position. A second important reason is pragmatic. The term social contracts is increasingly referred to in current discourses, particularly by prominent international organizations such as the IMF, the World Bank, and the ILO. Their different proposals for a new social contract do vary considerably, with different consequences for informal workers. But engaging with the underlying ideas can open up new spaces for dialogue. So although informal employment has always been the norm in the Global South, the fact that it's expanding in the Global North offers a window to rethink social justice and social contracts on a wider scale. So what are some of the key elements of the social contracts, particularly when we think about including the claims of informal workers? A social contract requires procedural, distributive, and participatory components. We've also added a recognition component, where recognition implies the need to call out the wrongness of demeaning and stigmatizing policies and practice. Each of these elements comes up regularly in the testimonies of informal workers. The procedural function is concerned with the legal enforcement of human and civil rights and collective security from external threats. But informal workers are often constrained rather than supported by many policy and legal conditions, as Marlies will also speak to later. Sarah Reed, one of the authors of the book, gives many examples of punitive measures experienced by informal workers at the hands of the state, even those classified as essential workers during COVID. So realizing a new social contract for informal workers means transforming existing and legal and regulatory frameworks. Secondly, the distributive dimension of the social contract is concerned with access to infrastructure, private and public property, health, education, social services, and social protection, and is supported by tools of monetary and fiscal policy. In their chapters, Marty and Laura discuss emerging models and the claims of workers in these areas. For example, social protection for informal workers needs to include both social insurance as well as social assistance to provide work-related protections, benefits that they need, for example, including childcare services. Also in a chapter on taxation, Mike Rogan discusses tax systems and tax reforms which recognize the contributions of informal workers and offer reciprocity, so a different approach to thinking about taxation. The participatory function entails involvement of society in political decision-making processes at different levels. it's crucial that stakeholders not only initiate an original contract, but are participants in a continuing process. And the book really offers several promising examples of ways in which informal worker organizations have been able to open up wider spaces for participation in policy platforms from which they've previously been excluded. Lastly, the recognition function is not a part of a traditional social contract formulation, but it came out very clearly from informal worker narratives that the relational aspects are important in determining a fair contract, which is concerned with what kind of standing a person has and should have in relation to others. So the upholding of dignity and the need to be recognized across a broad spectrum of relationships and the multiple identities of informal workers, as women and men, as carers, and as members of society all need to be taken into account. Lastly, a few cross-cutting themes in the book that kind of, when we look at this intersection between social contracts and informal workers. Firstly, we're talking about social contract from below, and this is a novel approach of the book. It's informed by informal worker voices and achieved through collective action. Secondly, there are competing visions of what an ideal social contract can look like. And how it can include informal workers. These are articulated by different institutions, different multilateral agencies, but this kind of diversity shows that it's important for an ideal vision to be informed by the voices and evidence from workers themselves. Thirdly, the journey of social contracting and the destination of a better social contract need to be held together. So the vision for an ideal social contract must go hand in hand with a strategy for achieving it. Broad-based grassroots movements and strategies to realize the vision are needed. Otherwise, as Marty will come to later, we run the risk of falling from a bad to a worse social contract. Issues of power and the power of capital are often neglected in idealistic visions of social contracts, where assumptions of equality can mask deep-seated inequalities. And the book is informed by the view that growth and development of informal economies are deeply interwoven and shaped by processes of industrialization, modernization, and capital accumulation. Another cross-cutting theme is that informal workers include a wide range of workers and identities. And the book really tries to open up a diverse tapestry that shows the complex and diverse reality of informal workers. About the state, it can't be assumed to be neutral, monolithic, benevolent, democratic, consistent, or capable. And so it's important to problematize the state, in some cases understanding the actual informal nature of the state and its different institutions at national and local levels. And lastly, what do we mean by formalization? This is a common thread through the book, which really seeks to challenge common concepts of formalization. My co-speakers will speak more to this, but just to say that the book's informed by an understanding that any process of formalization needs to be tailored to the different needs of various segments of the informal workforce and encompass both the benefits of formality and the costs of entry into the formal economy. I'm going to stop there and pass back to Minouche.
Great, thank you so much, Sophie. And I think you've made a very good case for why talking about social contracts in the context of informal workers is relevant and can be made to apply, even though conceptually it was developed in a different context. The notion of reciprocity between actors in a society is very strong, and many of the themes that you've drawn out, whether it's a perspective from below or thinking about the state in different ways, and including the wider relationships between families, communities beyond the state as part of the social contract, make it, I think, highly relevant and applicable to a wide set of contexts that you've shown how we have to think about it differently, and that's been really useful. I'll turn now to Laura Alfers, who's the Director of the Social Protection Program at WeGo and Research Associate in the Department of Sociology at Rhodes University. And Laura will talk about social protection and the social contract for workers in the informal economy, and particularly what it means for our systems of social protection if they're going to do justice to informal sector workers. So over to you, Laura.
Thanks very much, Minouche, and thank you, Sophie, for that introduction. when we put together this volume, we deliberately only made one chapter about social protection. Very often when people are talking about we need a new social protection, they tend to be thinking we need social protection, which is true. But I think in this volume, we wanted to highlight the sort of multiplicity of concerns, actually, when you put workers at the center and the variety of protections that are needed. But nevertheless, my co-author, who is actually Rachel Moussier, and I, wanted to insert a chapter on social protection. And what we did was we decided to focus on the social contract as a process. And this is really one of the sort of conceptual issues we wanted to highlight. Sophie mentioned the social contract versus social contracting. And we wanted to sort of identify where informal workers were in sort of developing their advocacy and sort of negotiations around access to social protection. So we looked at 3 short case studies, one from sort of work we'd been doing in sub-Saharan Africa, and then examples from India and Thailand. And the conceptual contribution, we wanted to link theory and practice, and in particular a theory called the power resources theory, which is often used to understand worker mobilization, but has really been applied to workers in the informal economy, and very much inspired by a collected volume, Webster et al., Crossing the Divide, Precarious Work and the Future of Labor. We wanted to take the application a step further, though. The Webster et al. Book tends to focus very much on power resources as a method for bringing people together, for organizing workers. And we wanted to see at what point we could think about how power resources can help us actually understand organizing and policy change at the same time, how workers were drawing on power to challenge existing policies. And then, as I mentioned, really wanting to understand and highlight the social contract as a process rather than as a singular event. One sort of important piece of background is that informal workers fall through the cracks of many processes which are involved, or many fora which are a central part of the process of social contracting. For example, if we think about tripartite dialogue spaces, which is really the space where formal labor can engage around policy and rule setting processes, informal workers are often either excluded by law in the fact that self-employed workers may not have representation, or it's not clear whether they would be represented as business or labor. So quite often they may only have indirect access, through a relationship with either employers or trade unions, but certainly no direct representation. And then if we look at the other part of social protection, the sort of cash grant social assistance mechanisms, we see there are social accountability mechanisms, but tend to be oriented towards the poor or marginalized group. And informal workers may be part of these groups, but certainly not in their identity as workers. So when we look at it like that, we see a gap, right? This is where informal workers fall through the cracks. But is that all we can say? Obviously not. And so this is again where we wanted to use the power resources theory to help us think about where moments of engagement are happening, where they have been successful and where they have been less successful, and why. And so just to give you a brief overview of the sort of 4 components of the power resources theory, it identifies 4 sources of power. I won't go through all of them, but the ones that we thought were most sort of relevant to the workers, to the work of the organizations with, who we were working with, was institutional power. So this is where past social compromises are embedded in current institutional arrangements. So I mentioned social dialogue platforms. How are informal workers trying to get access to those, and when and how has that been successful? Social power. This is where workers might engage in wider social justice issues, often in coalition with other social movements concerned about broader issues, and through that gain some kind of widespread sort of mobilization and support for issues. And then associational power, technical and other capacities derived from large and well-resourced worker organizations. So these three areas. The fourth is structural power, which is about power in the economy to disrupt market forces, because we are working with often workers who are much more vulnerable and weaker in the informal economy. That source of power was less available, but so we did draw on the bottom three to see what we could identify. One of our case studies looked at allying with institutional power in sub-Saharan Africa. So this is where we saw organizations actively allying with the formal trade union movement in order to access these tripartite social dialogue spaces. And we particularly see this in sub-Saharan Africa because the formal trade union movement is much more open to allying with organizations of informal workers. So we had examples from Zambia and Ghana where the two groups have worked together, particularly around pension reforms and health insurance. But what are the concerns? I think one thing that came up very clearly through this research was a sense that informal workers should have a space at the table directly. That while trade unions were very useful for getting an issue to the table, they weren't always necessarily best placed to know what the issues of informal workers themselves were, particularly the self-employed. So there were concerns that we should be speaking on our behalf. We also identified some of the political barriers to this. In Ghana, for example, where the trade unions have for a long time allied with informal workers, one of the representatives from the Trade Union Congress said, well, it's very difficult because the government aren't going to allow two labor representatives, government and business aren't going to allow two labor representatives to sit on the tripartite council. So we're having to think of different ways that we can actually get informal workers directly represented. I think we also saw that trade union spaces can be highly masculine spaces, and that it was often very difficult for women workers to express their needs for social protection. So in one of our workshops that we'd held, in our Crossing the Divide workshop, women found it very hard to articulate and actually get their demands for maternity benefits seriously taken up across both the formal and informal spaces. Our case study 2, we looked at how, in some cases, informal worker organizations were allying with wider social movements to push for change. And this is particularly important for women workers for whom access to public services is really important, health and childcare. And so also where maybe alliances with the formal labor movement are quite hard, and it's not always an easy relationship. And so we looked in particular at HomeNet Thailand, who had been involved in a very important alliance with the network of people's organizations to push for a universal health coverage law. And they were sort of one of 9 organizations covering a range of different social actors who took up the issue of universal health coverage and managed to work the political process to their favor. The concern here was that they very often got lumped with the poor. When they were actually trying to say, well, we are workers, right? We have working concerns. And actually, for example, we want occupational health services to be incorporated into primary healthcare. But it was very difficult for them to be heard as working people with working concerns. And that is often an issue in these kinds of spaces. And then lastly, harnessing associational power through co-production. And this is perhaps a different take on associational power from how it is often used in relation to formal trade unions. But we have within the WeGo network large, well-resourced organizations of informal workers, such as the Self-Employed Women's Association in India, but also cooperatives in Latin America, who have the capacity to provide services for their own members, to provide protections for their own members. And this isn't simply a sort of pragmatic tool to provide services. Of course, it's a pragmatic tool to provide services and to assist in organizing, but it is also a political action. For one thing, these organizations then become seen as experts, right, who get called on to share their knowledge in national policy spaces. We've also seen in a couple of cases where the cooperatives or services set up by worker organizations are integrated into the state. So you have a partnership with public financing, but the actual provision is done through cooperatives, as in the Sewa childcare model. And also often that involves building relationships with the frontline bureaucracy of the state, allowing for policy influence to happen at that level. Of course, there are many debates about, whether we can see this as a progressive thing, debates about this as a downloading of responsibility from the state onto poorer women, and, the return to say, well, actually, this is a way of empowering citizens. This is a way of building the partnerships we need to actually build up a new social contract. So again, quite a lot of debate around that. So in conclusion, and here's where I'll end, the social contract is not a singular event. It is a process. And it is a process that needs to be tracked and documented. I think we don't do that enough. These moments of engagement and what is actually happening with them, what are they doing, and sitting back and reflecting on that is important. When it comes to social protection, we are seeing organizations of informal workers engaging in process to influence policy. They may not always look like traditional modes of policy influence. And so we also need to be open to understanding those different modes of influence. And then also the use of theory was very useful here. Power resources theory sort of really helping us to think through in a systematic way what we've been seeing within the broader WIGO network, and thinking through what implications that might have for bigger change in the world and how we build a social contract. And I'll leave it there, and back to you, Manoush.
Thank you, Laura. I think it's so interesting how you showed how informal workers can participate in processes which benefit them, whether it be with collaborating with trade unions alongside government, or through self-insurance mechanisms and ways to use their networks to be able to deliver better social contracts for themselves. But many issues underline that, as you said, about are we letting the state off the hook in terms of supporting its citizens, and is formalization an inevitable path in order to get a better social contract for informal workers? But I think we're going to come back to that big debate about formalization later. Let me now turn to Marlies van Bromsen, who is the director of the law program at WIGO, and she is going to talk about human rights and transnational social contracts, and particularly the issue of home workers and whether a social contract can do a better job of recognizing the distinct contributions of home workers in global supply chains, and how human rights law might play a role in advocating for better conditions for them. Over to you, Marlies.
Thank you very much, Manoush. Thanks very much, Manoush, and greetings, everybody. It's wonderful to be here. It's quite a challenge to talk in 11 minutes, so let me get going. So as Manoush mentioned, I will be speaking about transnational social contracts, and specifically from the perspective of home workers. So home workers are usually women who work from their homes and are subcontracted by factories to be part of production, either in domestic or global supply chains. Next, please. So to set the scene for this discussion, I will begin by rehearsing the fundamental premises of the prototypical national social contract that Sophie referred to, and how it's institutionalized through law. And then I'll have a very brief discussion on global supply chains which have disrupted this national social contract. Next, please. So this is a diagram of the social contract under democratic industrial capitalism that Sophie referred to. And I think the first important point to make here is that it was hard won. It involved mobilizing, organizing industrial action, which was often violent. Factories were often burnt down. And so this, just a reminder for us that any new social contract will be the outcome of struggle. So briefly, to go through what the trade-offs were between the three parties, the owner of capital, the organized labor, and the state. So capital needed to pay labor, usually men, enough to reproduce themselves, to have a family, and to buy the mass-produced consumer products that these factories were churning out. Labour, on the other hand, agreed to be subordinated to the factory management in exchange for stability of income, the fact that their incomes would rise with more efficient production, and social security. Capital relied on the state to provide the legal institutions, primarily property rights, that are necessary for profit making, policies to facilitate technological innovation and export their goods to foreign markets. And then finally, they also needed the state to provide public goods, both for its current and future workforce in the form of social security, health, and education. And the state needed a couple of things from capital, but importantly, it used the mechanism of the employment contract as a way to collect social security contributions. Next, please. So I'm going to leave you to read this wonderful quote from Bush and Rogers, but it really shows that labor law was constitutive of the social contract. It institutionalized the social contract. And it promoted in industrial stability, a democratization of the economy, and through collective bargaining, a means of redistribution. But there are three important points to make here. So the first is it assumes a closed national system. The second is that it recognizes only three social partners: the national state, organized labor, meaning workers with a standard employment contract who are unionized, and thirdly, organized employers. So it excludes small enterprises, for example, who are also employers. And importantly for us, it excludes home workers. Why? Because labor law categorizes rather home workers as independent contractors, when in fact they're disguised employees. The third point to make about labor law is it recognizes only one type of organization for worker representation, namely trade unions. Next slide, please. So this is a slide that speaks to the rise of global value chains for these 5 reasons. Arlo refers to it as global supply chains, and with it, the international division of labor. And as the next slide shows, the outsourcing and subcontracting and offshoring of production looked like this. So for example, New Look, which is a UK company, a UK clothing brand, procures its garments from 25 countries in 4 continents. H&M from 41 countries in 3 continents. And the key thing here is there's no legal relationship between brands and the workers that make their goods. There's also no need to pay their workers to reproduce themselves, to feed and house and school children. Neither do they need to pay them enough to afford consumer products. So the final slide, just in looking at the global supply chain, is to look at how home workers are, next slide, are contracted into the supply chain. So this is a picture on the left-hand side of a woman in Tirupur, India. Tirupur is known as the t-shirt factory of the world. About 400 brands are getting their t-shirts and track pants made here. And she has got her pile of clothing that she will take into her home to do cutting of threads, in her case. Others stitch, others embellish, and others would do things like screen printing. On the right-hand side is a diagram of how home workers are contracted into supply chains. So you will see at the top is a global brand who contracts a first-tier supplier, who then contracts a second-tier supplier. And then there are 2 ways in which home workers are contracted. On the one hand, on the left, you'll see that the second-tier supplier contracts to bigger workshops, which subcontracts to smaller workshops, which in turn then subcontract to home workers. On the right-hand side, you'll see the other version, which is that the second-tier supplier, the factory, contracts directly with the home worker through a labor broker, and then through subcontractors who are often members of the community. They'll go and find home workers to contract to. And maybe just to add here in Tirupur, the little trucks that stop outside every house, dropping off piles of work to each of the home workers. The next slide, please. So now we're going to move to a new social contract and one that could include home workers excluded from the national social contract in most countries. And next slide, we're going to be doing a bit of theory building in this presentation very quick. The chapter draws on three pieces of theory. The one is Teubner and Fischer-Lascano's theory that reimagines the social order. The second is a paper by international law lawyers looking at the multiple identities that each of us has, and therefore the potential for different solidarities that form the basis of social contract. And then finally, like Laura, looking at power, but looking at Eric Olin Wright's work, who's theorized on the power that's available to trade unions. So just briefly, one slide for each of those theoretical framings and moving to the next slide. So Teubner and Lascano's theory of the global social order is very helpful, I think, when we think about transnational social contracts. So their framework suggests two matrices. The bottom matrix is the world order as we know it, divided into nation states. And then superimposed on this matrix are plural matrices that are determined by the issue or the sector, rather than by spatial geographies. So for example, by the garment sector, by the electronics sector. And these issues knit together populations across territorial boundaries and regulates their behavior in relation to the specific issue. So I'm going to be talking here forth about the garment sector in a moment. But just to move quickly to the next slide, which is showing if one takes the perspective of a person at the middle, the worker is in the center, and thinks about their multiple identities. This slide helps us think about social contracts not as a single social contract, but as plural overlapping social contracts at different scales. So looking at the circle on the right, home workers will have much in common. So remember, they work from home, much in common with people in their communities, thinking about infrastructure issues in their homes and participation at the city level. So there's a social contract at the level of the city. On the left-hand side and the top, home workers will find solidarity with workers in informal employment from other sectors, domestic workers, street vendors, who are fighting for recognition as workers at the national level. And then finally, at the bottom, if we think about the sector-based issue of the Teubner-Lascano theory, workers would find solidarity with other garment workers, depending on which sector they're in. So in this case, in the garment sector, with workers across the world, across spatial boundaries. The third, next slide, refers to the two sources of power identified by Olin Wright that are available to trade unions. And he talks about it slightly differently to the way that Laura put it. So structural power is the power that's available to them because their labor is indispensable to industrial capitalism. And that's why they can withhold their labor as a source of power. Then associational power is the power they draw on because they can resort to collective action, and in particular to collective bargaining. Now, of course, for home workers, neither of these sources of power are available to them because their labor is not indispensable. A brand can simply move to another country. And the same goes with associational power, where their organizations are not even recognized as collective organizations. Other authors have also referred to institutional power in the way that Laura referred to. So I'm going to move now to the third part of the presentation, which is looking at a specific process that's taking place at the moment in the European Union. It's a lawmaking process, a social contracting process within multiple sectors, but within supply chains and home workers' involvement therein. So next slide, please. So in December 2020, the European Union Parliament formally requested the European Union Commission to draft a legal framework that would make it mandatory for companies to take responsibility for environmental and labor rights violations that are caused by their business operations, including in their supply chains. And there were a number of NGOs in Brussels that formed a coalition to advocate jointly with respect to this process. And these included the European Coalition for Corporate Justice, Amnesty International, the Clean Clothes Campaign, Oxfam, Earthlife, and many others. And in this context, organizations such as the Clean Clothes Campaign, which is a network, is a source of power for home workers and for many workers in countries where there's garment production. So their source of power is that they campaign against brands. They do research, and then they use this research and the information they get from their networks to, one of the things they do is they campaign against brands, and the risk for brands is their reputational loss and that consumers will stop buying their goods. And so this is a form of consumer power, which of course is different to withholding one's labor. And it's this piece that we can draw on, or home workers rather can draw on. So next slide, please. So we go HomeNet South Asia and HomeNet Southeast Asia. These are networks of home workers in Asia, home worker organizations, became members of the Clean Clothes Campaign, both to advocate for the inclusion of home workers, but also to gain information on the process that would facilitate home workers' direct participation in the process. In February 2022, after probably 18 months of working very closely with the Clean Clothes Campaign, the campaign made a decision that it would be one of its top 3 priorities that the lawmaking process would include all workers in the whole chain, right down to home workers. And this was reflected also then by the NGO coalition, the Border Coalition. Finally, on the 23rd of February, the European Union Commission published the draft directive, and this draft directive included the whole chain. And it was a huge win because the legislation in Germany and the legislation in France included only factory workers in the first tier of the chain. Next slide, please. But apart from the work with the Clean Clothes Campaign and some of the members of the Border NGO Coalition, home worker organizations participated directly in the process. On the left, you see a platform of demands, which was addressed to European Union policymakers, drafted by 14 organizations of home workers, making specific requests of the European Commission. On the right-hand side is an open letter that was sent by all these organizations. And there were slow processes with 14, 15 organizations across 9 countries that are members of these networks, which was an open letter sent to every European Union commissioner, setting out the demands of workers in the chain and specifically home workers. So just to move now to some concluding thoughts. So a garment sector social contract is being forged through multiple initiatives at national and global levels, through what's called brand enforcement agreements, living wage campaigns, global framework agreements of trade unions with particular brands, litigation at the national level by members of the Asia Floor Wage Alliance, industrial action. It's messy, it's contested, and sometimes it's even violent. What is interesting at the transnational level, the limitations of labor law are being overcome by a resort to human rights law and to contract law. And I guess just to end with a normative statement, which is really that this time all workers and all employers must participate in contract formation. Otherwise, what we do is we create new insiders and new outsiders, as Sophie referred to, and the law will then protect some workers or some people at the cost of others. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marlies, and thank you so much for drawing out what the global supply chain looks like at the local level. It was so interesting to hear your description of that, and looking at how, just as we have global supply chains affecting informal sector workers and home workers, we can also have individuals in advanced economies and rich countries at the other end of the supply chain exercising power and influence on it, both positively and negatively. And one has to look at these things in a very integrated way. And I think you did that very, very well. Let's turn now to our final presentation, which is from Marty Chen, who's Senior Advisor of WAGO and a lecturer in urban planning and design at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard University. And Marty's going to talk about informal workers, particularly post-pandemic, and whether we revert to the battle social contract, an even worse social contract, or whether there's an opportunity for one that is much, much better in the wake of the pandemic. So Marty, over to you.
Sorry. Thank you so much, Minouche. And I'm trying to, to get my slides up, but I got the wrong one up. Here we go. And so, as Minouche has said and my colleagues have referenced, I'm going to talk about the three possible scenarios at this particular COVID moment. And there's such a danger that we'll revert to a bad old deal or worse, new contract. And what we're really hoping for is this better new contract for informal workers. So I will speak quickly about what we learned about COVID and informal workers, and then go on to speaking a little bit about what the bad old contract looked like and our worries about the even worse new contract, and then our hopes, and really the hopes of informal workers for a better new contract. The COVID pandemic recession, we know, had a disproportionate impact on informal workers who largely depend on daily earnings. They can't work remotely on Zoom or on emails. And we did a study. WeGo led a study in 11 cities with partnering with organizations of informal workers in each city. And we found indeed that in April 2020, during the peak lockdowns and restrictions in all of the cities, 2/3 of the informal workers were not able to work at all, and their median earnings had dropped to 1/3 of their pre-COVID earnings. And I should note that their pre-COVID earnings were quite low on average. To cope over the ensuing year, over half had to draw down savings, nearly half borrowed money, and 18% pawned or sold their assets. By mid-2021, we did a longitudinal study, so we looked again at mid-2021. 1 in 5 of the workers were not able to work, and their median earnings were only 2/3 of the pre-COVID earnings. And we also tracked and found that the vast majority had not been able to replenish any of their savings. But fortunately, in a way, the COVID pandemic shone a spotlight on 2 aspects of the work and lives of informal workers. One is the pre-existing disadvantages and injustices faced by these workers, not only in the work arena, but also in the health domain. And perhaps most importantly, the pandemic recessions shone a spotlight on the essential work of informal workers, the fact that they were frontline essential workers, producing, processing, selling, cooking, and delivering food, providing healthcare, childcare, elder care, providing cleaning, transport, waste removal, and other essential services. Clearly, there is a need for a new social contract, as you've been hearing, for informal workers. And this new social contract needs to be based on the recognition that informal workers are the majority of workers and the vast majority of the working poor worldwide. The majority of all workers in the emerging countries, but also globally, are informal, and the vast majority of workers in developing countries. And we also know from the ILO data 2018 that informal workers are more likely than formal workers to be from poor households in all country income groups. This new social contract also needs to be based on the reality of informal work, not some abstract, unrealistic notion of a universal worker of labor as in aggregate, of a universal worker in a recognized employer-employee relationship. Nearly half of all workers globally and over 2/3 of informal workers are self-employed. The social contract, the new social contract, needs to understand that the self-employed have a relationship with the state as well as with capital. But we worry that there are these three possible scenarios in this COVID moment for informal workers going forward. One is a reversion to the bad old contract, to the pre-COVID negative status quo. But I think what worries us even more is the real possibility of an even worse contract, a worsening of the situation. And what informal workers are hoping for and what we're supporting them to demand is this better new contract with an inclusive and enabling policy environment and fair employment and commercial relationships. So let me say a couple of words about the bad old and the new worse. There were key challenges for informal workers before COVID. The lack of legal recognition, the lack of valuation of their economic contributions, the lack of social protection. Almost by definition, informal workers do not get social protection through work. And there was this stigmatization and penalization of the informal workers that my colleagues have referred to. And there was this lack of an institutional space for collective representation of informal workers. And we have done research over these past 25 years on what's really driving this status quo. And we've pointed to two things, perhaps: the political and policy bias towards the powerful economic actors, and the negative narratives about the informal economy. I'll just mention three of the negative narratives. One is that informal work is somehow an abnormality, and yet 61% of all workers are informally employed. That informal workers seek to evade taxes and regulations, and yet informal workers are subject to a range of fees, licenses, and market levies, and they pay value-added tax on their supplies and stock. Also, the regulations that they face tend to be cumbersome or irrelevant or even harsh. And the third negative is that the third negative narrative is that informal workers fall somehow outside the reach of the state. And yet every day informal workers fall inside the punitive arm of the state, but outside the protective arm. What about this even worse contract? There's mounting evidence, and we have sort of a grassroots grounded intelligence on this, that there's an intensification of predatory capitalism, as we would call it, in the form of lower wages and longer working hours, lack of compensation for overtime, or canceled work orders for the subcontracted workers. And there's intensification of repressive government measures in often the name of economic recovery or public health. This takes the form of destruction of the markets, the infrastructure, the equipment of street vendors. This takes the form of the closure of the collection sites, of the dump sites, and the sorting areas of waste pickers. And there's evidence of growing regressive solidarity between state and capital, regressive policy and regulatory reforms, regressive taxation, and the privatization of public space and public services, including waste management. There's also a growing risk of inappropriate application of the social contract, application of unfavorable formalization, which is focused on registration and levying taxes on the informal workers and their enterprises, without the incentives and benefits of formalization, without recognizing, valuing, and protecting the informal workforce. There's also a growing risk that the comprehensive systems of social protection, where they existed, are being dismantled. And comprehensive system would include both social assistance and social protection, but we're seeing more and more bias towards minimalist safety nets and private insurance. So this is a pivotal moment. And I know that there are many items on the global agenda, not least climate change at this critical moment, that have the fierce urgency of now, in the words of Martin Luther King. But I truly believe, and my colleagues do, that this is a pivotal moment for the majority of workers and the vast majority of informal workers. The COVID-19 pandemic recession, as I've said, has exposed and exacerbated the pre-existing disadvantages and injustices that the informal workers face. And it had a disproportionately negative impact on informal workers. They're in deep holes without savings, deep in debt, and often without the assets that they once owned. And it's shown a spotlight on the fact that they produce many of the essential goods and services that we now need and that we've come to recognize our dependence on during the pandemic recession. But there is this real chance of an even worse deal. These informal workers are not being targeted or reached by government recovery schemes, but they are being targeted and reached, negatively impacted by these trends that I mentioned, the predatory capitalism, the repressive states, and the regressive solidarity between state and capital. So we believe, and the informal workers deeply need and want, a better new contract. And it's needed now more than ever before to reduce poverty and inequality and to contribute to economic growth. They compromise the broad base of the economy. And it's possible now more than ever before, due to the recognition of their size and of their contribution as essential workers, and the recognition of the disproportionate impact of the pandemic recession. So what we are asking is, if not now, then when? This is the moment to think through, to demand, to promote, and eventually to implement a new social contract for informal workers. And we hope that the evidence in this book and that my colleagues have shared, particularly the processes in which organizations of informal workers are engaging with the state and with capital to forge a better new contract, will inspire what informal workers need and want. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marty. Thank you very much for that, I don't want to say pessimistic, but sort of quite realistic analysis of the juncture that we're at the moment and the different directions it could go in. I'll start actually, if I may, just with a question for each of you, and then I'm going to turn to the very excellent questions we've got coming in on the chat. And I'll start with Marty, if I may. You know, in my own book on the social contract, I very much argue that all workers should receive benefits regardless of the nature of their contract, or whether they are formal or informal. And we've seen with the digital revolution that the possibility to, for example, do cash transfers to low-income households in a very rapid and cost-effective way. And we also are in a world in which informalization has become very widespread in advanced economies. You know, I often say the gig economy is just a cool word for the informal sector. And so we are starting to have to think about how do we provide benefits to workers who are in informal arrangements. My own view is that, you know, just as in many countries we've moved to have portable pension pots, where if you move from one job to another, you can take your pension with you. We should increasingly be thinking of workers having portable benefit pots. And so if I'm an informal sector worker working for providing services to 3 corporations, let's just say, each of them would have to contribute a little bit to my benefit pot, whether that's sick leave or pension or even training costs, for example. Could you envision that sort of system working in the future as part of a better social contract? That's for Marty, and you're on mute. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Minouche. That's such an important question. And I do think the idea of portable benefits and multiple contributors to a single pot has to be part of the way we think about it. And just to comment on the digital, we do know that more and more governments are trying to digitalize their service provision. And in the wake of COVID pandemic recession, there are movements of the organizations of workers to enroll the home workers and other informal workers in social registries so that they can get more of the flow of the state resources. But we also know that the digital platforms are actually, like you said, creating more informal workers without the social protection contribution, because it gives the owners of the platforms, like the brand names in the supply chains, are able to distance themselves from the workers and call them independent while they are actually fully dependent. So I think we need both a moral case and a legal case that the owners of capital need to contribute to workers of all kinds in their supply chains, on their platforms, in their employ. And this is where to me, it's both a moral and a legal case that needs to be made. Thank you.
Well, Marty, that brings me really nicely to Marlise's paper and a question for her. Because Marlise, you talked about consumer pressure on clothing manufacturers that enabled a requirement to have better standards for their workers. And I wanted to ask you about your thoughts about what are essentially voluntary approaches through consumer pressures and social movements versus legal approaches, which are either human rights laws and supply chain laws in the European Union or local laws which mandate certain standards. How do you see the balance between voluntary and legal approaches to improve the social contract for home workers in particular?
So that's a really good question. So I don't know that we should have in legal terms, we'd call the voluntary soft law and the legal one's hard law. I think perhaps it's not necessarily helpful to think about it in a binary, in that I think that one can have law, but unless you have social power backing the law, there isn't real enforcement of the law. And so it's so critically important. I think hard law is very important, but one has to, A, have the social power to enforce the law, and secondly, I think the enforcement mechanisms are crucial. So, for example, we have the modern slavery law in the UK, we have a supply chain law in California, but the enforcement mechanisms are so weak. It's basically, well, you must do due diligence in your supply chain, and you must report this on your website, and if you don't do anything about it, there's no real sanction. So that's the big fight at the moment, or one of them, in the context of the European Union legislation, that directors would be held liable for not addressing human rights and environmental violations in their supply chains. I think maybe just to add one other thing is that there's also a move in the, so when one thinks about law, one tends to think about statutory law, but of course there's also private law, which is contract law, and that forms the basis of collective bargaining, which is often more easily enforceable. And so a number of the social movement organizations are, and there's precedence for it, concluding contracts are enforceable in courts with particular brands relating to particular issues in their supply chain. So I think that's another piece of law that's very important.
Okay, thank you. And then I've got a question really for Sophie and Laura, which goes to the perennial debate about formalization, and is formalization necessary for a better social contract? And the question is really around, you both talked about ways that informal workers could get a better social contract by participating in, say, tripartite negotiations or providing collective insurance to each other. SEWA, of course, is a great example of providing insurance through pooling risk among a very large group of women workers. But what about the argument that, part of the social contract is around social insurance, but part of it is also about investment, investing in people, in their skills, in terms of enabling them to invest in assets. And what would you say to the argument that in order to deliver on the investment side of the social contract, you actually need formalization? So either one of you, Sophie or Laura, what do you think?
I can have a stab first, Sophie, if you want to come in after me. I think that's another really good question. And I think probably we have to break apart what we mean by formalization as well, because that is a word which has multiple and contested meanings itself, in the way that for example, many local governments sort of understand formalization. It's about regulation and taxation and fairly punitive measures without the sort of protective elements. And in that case, I'm not sure formalization does lead to, in greater investments, because quite often that kind of formalization is leading to more informality and the closure. I mean, it's excluding. Marlies mentioned, you've actually got to have an inclusive space, because otherwise you're just creating new outsiders. And I think that type of formalization is what happens. I think, through the International Labour Organization's recommendation 204 on the transition to formality, there's a much more sort of broader definition of formalization, which really is about balancing the costs of entry into the formal economy with the provision of protections, the necessary protections and support. And there I can buy the argument that perhaps some kind of formalization is needed in order for society to move forward. I think as well, though, if we look at the International Labour Organization's definition of formalization, they've got two, because we know that the informal economy is heterogeneous, right? It might be that an enterprise, even in the widest definition of formalization, is formalizable. But if we're talking about a contributing family worker, a woman who's working as a contributing family worker at the bottom of the pyramid, how formalizable, what are we talking about here? I don't know. And in that case, even the ILO's definition of formalization, they say there's two types. We can talk about the formalization now, but we can talk about investments in health and education and macroeconomic policy, which may not mean everybody formalizes now, but it means that the conditions for greater formality exist in future. And I think, again, that's another definition of formality, which is part of the mix. So I think it's important in answering that question that we really understand quite clearly what we mean by formalization first, and understand which parts of the informal economy are even formalizable, or whether it's even desirable, because there may be parts of the informal economy where it's better just to leave things as it is and focus on the longer term vision. Thanks.
Thanks, Laura and Minouche. I was struck reading through some of the chapters and kind of the evidence coming in, how informal workers sort of imagine the state and the state that they are looking for. And so it wasn't, I mean, this was just kind of my reading of it, but they weren't describing formal versus informal state, that obviously that came through, but really looking for a responsive state. And the claim for reciprocity and being heard and seen sort of shaped that as well. And a state that would here not just give infrastructure that fitted everyone, but also that was tailored to their needs. So I think there's something there around responsive states, and that shapes how we understand formalization.
Brings me quite naturally to the first question, which is, I think, really for Sophie, which comes from Winnie Mutala, who asks, I think the challenge is how state and other actors can share responsibilities that ensure that the social contract, in particular between state and informal workers, is operationalized and honored. How do you see other actors working with the state in this process? And should the state remain the lead actor? Sophie, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, just a quick first response from me, but then it would be great if any of the other presenters just have any practical examples of kind of working together between actors. I think the question just really captures a lot of the spirit of the book, and that we need to have a thick description of a web of relationships, and that's what informal workers experience. So citizen-citizen relationships matter, labor-labor, labor-citizen, there's this whole web of different relationships. And I think the question came in quite early on, and I hope some of the presentations really spoke to that as well. I don't think we can bypass the state, both because that's often the level at which legislation is being made. Though, of course, Marlies was talking about transnational levels of legislation, but that still involves states. And also that often it isn't that state is absent, as Marty said, kind of, it's that the state is very present, but often in a punitive way. So you have to start from where the state is, both normatively, but also just pragmatically. But it'd be great if anyone else has any kind of practical examples of good partnerships.
Anyone want to come in? Marty.
Just to say that just in the examples we had working with other social movements, and the Clean Clothes campaign and the People's Movement in Thailand. We had working with the EU. The WeGo facilitated a delegation of informal worker leaders for 2 years to engage with the ILO on its standard on formalization. So I think the organizations of workers find that they have to engage with and partner with a range of players on this issues. And just on formalization, 2 points. One is that for the workers themselves, a new social contract is perhaps the kind of formalization they would like. The other is that the official international definition of informal employment is not that you don't pay your taxes, or not that you're not registered. It's that you don't get social protection through your work. The one way to change the percentage of workers that are informal or formal is to extend social protection benefits to them. Now, the self-employed, it depends on whether their enterprise is registered. And there the challenge is that the registration procedures are either so difficult, or in some cases don't even exist. If you're a street vendor in most cities, there's no way to register. So we really have to unpack and rethink formalization. And a new social contract would be the kind of formalization that the workers would like.
Right. when I used to run infrastructure at the World Bank, we used to often say, first you provide the service, then you charge people for it. You can't charge them first and then and say, well, someday we'll give you social protection. First you provide the social protection and then you expect people to contribute through taxation and so on. And I think that certainly applies here. The next question is from Sarbaswara Sahu, and it's directed at Marlies. And the question is, home workers were the most vulnerable during COVID-19 in India. First, as they were not registered anywhere, they were ineligible to get any government support during lockdown. Second, when overseas orders were cancelled in the global supply chains, they were the first to not be paid their wages. How should we address these issues in future if such situations are repeated?
Sure, it's a big question, and I think perhaps I can say two things. The one is that these very interesting stories emerged, for example, from Tirupur, where home workers were organized, and where the organization in Tirupur, and I hope they might be here today, SAFE, were in fact reaching out to migrant workers who were employed in factories who weren't organized and offering the kind of social protection support that Laura referred to, that wasn't being provided by the state, but also was doing advocacy on behalf of the state. And so I think certainly one of the sort of bottom-up responses would be to be supporting organizing of home workers into their own organizations. But I think the second piece is just in the work that WeGo is doing together with HomeNet South Asia, HomeNet International, HomeNet Southeast Asia is increased. Sorry, let me take one step back. So in the context of this COVID crisis, what the Asia Floor Wage Alliance initiated, and it was a transnational coalition of people in Asia, but also organizations in other parts of the world, was to demand that brands pay into a COVID fund. And that this fund would then be redistributed to workers as a form of social protection, and particularly severance, where severance wasn't being paid to workers that lost their jobs. And so this prefigures the kind of thinking that organizations like the Clean Clothes Campaign are doing, which is that there should be some kind of ongoing social protection fund, and they've got quite a sophisticated way that they're thinking about it, that brands should be contributing to on an ongoing basis, and it would be calculated on the annual procurement cost from a particular country, and paid into a government fund. So yeah, let me leave it there.
We are running out of time, and I think I'm going to give the last question to Marty, if I may. In this pivotal moment, how do you see the role of the private sector? And what are some key actions that companies can take? For example, with the current sustainability transitions, waste is becoming more and more valuable. But how should informal workers be included in supply chains so that value is distributed more equitably? Are there good models that you have seen?
Again, a very big question. I should say that the IFC is just putting out a publication on how the private sector can support what they're calling, fortunately, the base of the pyramid, not the bottom. We sort of nudged them a bit on that. And there are a variety of mechanisms, including the ones that we've heard about from Marlies in the supply chains, which is the recognition of all the workers in their supply chains, not, historically they've had pressure at the factory level, but now there's recognition of all the workers down the chain. There's investments that can be made in the workers, seeing them, there was an old social contract between capital and labor when we had mass production, maybe in the 50s and 60s, and maybe for white men workers only, but there was a social compact. And workers were seen as important to capital, to invest in and support. One of the challenges is that 44% of all workers and over 2/3 of informal workers are self-employed. This actually disguises a lot of what Marlies referred to as disguised wage employment, because a lot of them are dependent contractors, not independent. But so we do have to work out the relationship between the truly self-employed and the owners of capital in the varieties of relationships that they have with capital, but also with the state. And so if you're urban, self-employed, genuinely self-employed, the primary enemy of the good is actually the state, because the local government is making it quite impossible for you to work. You're not seen as, so this is where we do have a chapter in the book on self-employment and the fact that labor in that case has a very strong, often punitive relationship with the state. And so we need to think of both the private sector and the state. And just one final word about the private sector. I've fought this battle with many of these reports. The IFC report said the private sector creates 9 out of 10 jobs in the world. The private sector does not. The private sector, widely understood, is the private corporate sector, right? The sector that creates most of the jobs in the world is actually the informal sector, the informal economy. And it's what Sewa, in the person of Ila Ben, the founder, calls the people sector. And I think we have to go forward thinking that the economy has got the public sector, it's got the private corporate sector, and then there's the people sector desperately creating their own work against great odds. So we have to rethink the private sector and let in the people sector. And so whenever I hear public-private partnerships, I always say, let's make it public-private people partnership, and then we'll get somewhere. So we have to rethink so many things. It's like turning a lot of the models on their heads to really incorporate the broad base of the economy going forward.
Well, thank you, Marty. That was a perfect point to end on. And I think this whole book is really about turning models on their head and making you think really differently about what a social contract could be, and shows very clearly the problems with our existing approaches, and makes a very compelling case for change. So I very much recommend it, and I wanted to thank all the panelists for excellent presentations and discussion, but more importantly for an excellent book that I hope will be a real contribution to the debate and help shape better social contracts for the majority of workers and the majority of people around the world. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to the audience for joining us. And I hope you found this session helpful, and I encourage you to read the book to learn even more.
And
Goodbye,
thanks
everyone.
to you, Manoush, for gracing the occasion. We really appreciate. Thank you so much. And we admire your book tremendously.
No, my pleasure. My pleasure. Thanks to all of you. Huh?
Thank you.
Thank you, Manoush.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye.